Hey guys, how you doing? Doug again, Recording Connection Audio Institute. We're going to take a look at the two major sections here in your edit window. We have already covered, the editing section in detail. In talking about the tools also, we covered it talking about the edit modes. So there's a lot of stuff here, in the last couple of videos about this section. Using the tools in this section, you can also, color sections and make your your session easily viewable. So if you wanted to color all your tracks, make them organized, you would just select the color of the track that you wanted. But you already know the functionality, like the grid mode and slip mode and how the tools work and things like that. So I won't spend too much more time on that. Really, the only thing, there's some stuff we haven't covered, but we definitely will cover more in this section as we go along. What I kind of want to focus on in this video here is, your tracks view area. I'm not going to explain in detail how to mix at this point. I just want to make that clear. So I will briefly explain what each of these sections do, but I'm not going to go into how to use them because we'll get to more of that later. I don't want to overload you with that. I will talk a little bit about the difference between inserts and sends, but I will leave that functionality for when we start mixing because it'll make a little bit more sense after we've done that. So without further ado, start here with your customizability of this particular section. You again, with everything in Pro Tools, it's fully customizable as to what you're going to see in this section. So I typically leave my I/O section and then one row of sends and one row of inserts up just because it makes it easier for me. But if you wanted to have your instruments viewable, you could do that. If you wanted to have, 2 rows of inserts and 2 rows of sends, you could definitely do that. You also have a comments section, good for, entering mic information and anything other than anything like that, any other information that you want to send here. You could write in this particular section mic preamps if you're using some type of external mic preamp. You would have that routing. We're going to stay focused on just kind of the basics here, just having exposed you to Pro Tools. So let's take a look at the I/O section, and that is this section right here. The I/O section basically dictates what your track is listening to for an input. Going back to your signal flow diagram, the I/O section, is like your switcher, right? You can listen to the preamp, you can listen to line input, you can listen to a bunch of different things, and we have the same capability with Pro Tools. We can listen to our interface, or we can listen from a bus, have something routed to any track, on your virtual console. This way here. So a good idea is to always check your inputs, make sure they're right for your session, especially when tracking, doing other things. If you're trying to print tracks and things like that, we'll get to more of that later. The output for most tracks would need to be either to your built-in output or outputting to a bus, but everything needs to end up at the stereo bus, which for this particular setup is referred to as built-in output 1 and 2. So a good rule of thumb is to when you get a session that's given to you, usually it's configured differently depending on what kind of hardware is used in that session. So, because my home setup, I have, very little outboard gear. It's a lot of plugins. It's mainly for mixing. I spend a lot of money on making my room sound good, buying plugins, some outboard gear for things like that. So I don't have a 192 or an HD setup. I do have just a regular interface, Focusrite interface. And, if I am getting a session that's come from a big studio, the first thing I need to do is change my output so that I'm outputting to my stereo bus and not outputting to whatever that big studio's stereo bus is. So something to be conscious of when you first get a session. Also in this section is a volume control. This is your fader. This is your large fader in this in your virtual console, and a pan usually. So that is that section there. Next is your sends in this particular area, and the sends are for sending a copy of the signal out to another place. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about the difference between inserts and sends in later videos. But, sending a copy of the signal doesn't stop it from going to my stereo bus. It adds amplitude to your ultimate, because I'll give you an example. If I'm sending a copy of this signal out to bus 11, okay, and I have an aux track here that's listening to bus 11, that means it's routing, that signal to bus 11, right? So I can process that again by putting an insert, on this particular channel, maybe a parallel compression chain, which we'll talk about, or a reverb or a time-based effect or something of that sort. So what's happening is on my track up here, it's copying this signal, sending it out to this aux, right, which is listening to bus 11, and then it's getting processed here and getting rerouted out again to my main output. Right, so you have to pay attention to the routing. So what a send does is it gives you a copy of the signal, and then you can dictate how much of that copy is being sent out by using another fader here. Okay, the inserts are in this next section, and this is typically where you'll put your plugins. Right, you'll either use them directly on the channel or on an aux channel or something like that. So inserts, generally speaking, are for EQ, dynamics, gates, limiters, things of that nature that are going to process 100% of the signal, because this is directly inserting something into our signal chain, right? So if there's any questions about the routing or like that, definitely take that up with your mentor, because we're not there yet in the book, but it doesn't hurt to start asking these questions now, because you want to become familiar with routing as soon as possible. Also, there's a ton of other tutorials online about routing and things like that. On our YouTube channel, which you can reach at the below listed link. So go ahead and that should be clickably activated too. So check out lots of tutorials available on routing and other topics as well. Let's talk about our tracks view section. First section here is where we rename tracks. The way I did that is just by double clicking on the track. And a useful tidbit is to go to the track below it. You just hit Command down, and you can actually rename all your tracks. So it also gives us buttons here. This is where you could record arm the track. You would also obviously have to set an input here, but you could record arm the track. And now it's listening to my voice. So this is record arm. It must be engaged for you to actually record on a track. If you'll see here, I've got nothing record arm, and when I try to record, it says no tracks are record enabled. So you would have to, enable a track, and then you can record on it, so on and so forth. The button that's grayed out here is for input monitoring. We'll talk a little bit about that, and that's typically, it's not here because it's not an HD system. This is my solo button, my mute button, and this is my waveform view, menu. So we can change to a number of different things, and we'll get to all of these in detail. One I never use is blocks view. Basically takes all the audio, the visual representation of your format, of your waves out, so that you're not confused visually. Playlist we'll talk about. It's a way of tracking. Your warp and analysis have to do with elastic audio. Waveform views where you'll typically stay. Volume would have a volume automation. Fader directly on the track would be useful for doing automation. Mute also for automation. Pan also for automation. You can also choose to automate, the levels of your send, which we'll talk about, or you can view automation by, opening up these sections here and writing your automation directly there. That way you can look at the waveforms and, not have anything visually impeding you there. So I reach that by hitting this button here. So there's all my automations. So that is this section here. Read has to do with automation. So if it's on read, that means it's reading the automation that's there. If automation is off, it's not paying attention to any automation that's been written, and it's not it's not able to write or record automation. So in case you don't know what automation is, what it is it allows you to adjust parameters in real time. So if I'm doing some, turn this on here. If I'm doing some written automation on my, let me just go back here to, you can actually, modify the way that your volume or your fader here, functions in real time. So to do that, you would just, click in the Smart Tool. Command in the Smart Tool and click actually lays a point, turns into the grabber tool, and you can adjust these things. And so if you watch your fader here, what happens when I play that section now? If you watch this section here, it's decreasing the volume. Anyways, automation we'll get to in detail later. You can automate a lot of different parameters in Pro Tools, and that's the way you reach it here. This is your samples or ticks changing. We'll talk about these in detail. Essentially, samples focuses on, well, I'll talk about it in detail in later videos. Won't bore you with that right now. And this is your Elastic Audio section here to enable Elastic Audio and to allow you to time stretch things, and we'll talk about that also in detail. So just an overview of everything you see here. This is the last thing we haven't talked about, has to deal with voices. And really in the normal version of Pro Tools, non-HD, this really it can be done a lot of different ways, so I wouldn't suggest using it, but it has to do with the voices. Basically, what a voice is in Pro Tools is a distinct audio channel. So there are a certain amount of voices that are dedicated to each session. And so a mono channel uses one voice, and a stereo channel uses two voices because it's essentially two mono signals. If you're using Quick Punch, which we'll talk about, that takes up an additional voice, and so on and so forth. So, I won't go into too much detail. Again, just a brief overview of these sections here so you can start playing with these things and become familiar with them. For now, don't worry about any of these advanced parameters. What I would suggest you doing is importing some audio, adjusting levels, adjusting your pans, creating a mix, because that's what we're going to dive into next after we talk about the mix window. So that's it for now, guys. There will be obviously plenty more to come. And again, tune in and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can, get access to more tutorials. We're constantly doing tutorials and having seminars, and I'll brief you about information that comes up with that. So I will talk to you guys later. Have a good one.